Between the 14th and 17th centuries, within the Balkan and Anatolian territories of the Ottoman Empire, a highly organized system of child recruitment and training, known to history as the Devşirme, was established and systematically operated. This system directly impacted the lives of hundreds of thousands of boys and their families over several centuries. This was not a random event or a spontaneous act, but the result of the deep structural needs of an empire in its phase of expansion and consolidation of power. It was a mechanism designed to create a military and administrative class that was absolutely loyal to the Sultan, independent of the traditional Turkish aristocracy and local affiliations that could challenge central authority. Today, we will analyze this complex system from historical, sociological, and political perspectives to clearly understand its operational mechanisms, multifaceted impacts, and the long-term legacy of the Devşirme system. Our primary educational objective is to identify the characteristics of a state-sponsored system capable of profoundly affecting minority groups and to draw crucial lessons for the protection of children's rights and vulnerable communities in the modern world. If you are interested in learning history not just to know the past, but also to equip yourself with the intellectual tools to build a safer future for the younger generation, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment to let us know where in the world you are watching from. Sharing historical knowledge responsibly is how we can collectively identify and prevent systemic models of abuse that might reappear in different forms in the present. To understand why a system like the Devşirme could exist and thrive for such a long period, we need to examine the political and social context of the Ottoman Empire during its formative and peak periods. According to the research of leading Ottoman historians, such as Professor Halil İnalcık from Ankara University, this era was characterized by a series of complex, interwoven factors. First, concerning the political element, the Ottoman Empire was a military entity on a path of relentless expansion. The sultans faced two major challenges: maintaining a battle-hardened, disciplined, and loyal army to continue conquests, while also controlling the power of the Turkish aristocracy, whose local interests and loyalties could threaten the emperor's centralized power. The Devşirme system was the answer to this problem. By recruiting children from non-Turkish, non-Muslim families, severing them from their roots, and raising them in an environment where the only loyalty was to the Sultan, the empire created a core force without any competing allegiances. Second, regarding the social element, Ottoman society was structured according to the millet system, which allowed different religious communities, like the Greek Orthodox or Armenian Apostolic, a degree of autonomy in civil matters under the empire's rule. However, these communities, known as dhimmi, protected people, had to accept a subordinate status and adhere to special regulations, including the payment of special taxes. The Devşirme system, in that context, was considered by the Ottoman authorities as a form of tax, a blood tax, that these communities had to contribute for the safety and stability of the empire that protected them. Third, on the economic front, maintaining a huge standing army and a burgeoning administrative apparatus required enormous human and financial resources. The Devşirme system provided a source of high-quality, well-trained manpower at a much lower initial cost than relying on mercenaries or aristocratic forces. These political, social, and economic conditions combined to create an environment that not only permitted but also fostered the development of the Devşirme system, turning it into an indispensable pillar of the Ottoman state for centuries, without facing organized resistance on a scale large enough to bring it down. It is important to note that the state practice of recruiting and training individuals from outside the ruling class to create a loyal force was not unique to the Ottoman Empire. In the same period or earlier, we see models with similar features around the world. The clearest example is the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. The Mamluks were initially slave soldiers, primarily of Turkic or Circassian origin, who were purchased at a young age, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained to become elite warriors. Over time, they rose to seize power and ruled Egypt and Syria themselves for nearly 3 centuries. Another example is the Sakaliba system in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, where Muslim rulers recruited slaves of Slavic and other European origins to serve in the army and administration, aiming to create a counterbalance to the Arab nobility. In Persia, the rulers of the Safavid dynasty also created a Ghilman force from captured or recruited Georgians and Armenians, with a purpose similar to the Ottoman Janissaries. This comparison reveals that the Devşirme system, despite its unique characteristics, was a product of a common logic of power in pre-modern empires: the need for a state-serving class whose loyalty was guaranteed by their detachment from all social, familial, and local roots. This indicates that the Devşirme was a product of structural causes related to empire building and the consolidation of central power, rather than an anomaly specific to Ottoman culture. Legally and religiously, the justification for the Devşirme system was a complex and controversial issue, even among Muslim scholars of the time. In principle, Sharia law protected the lives, property, and religious freedom of dhimmi communities as long as they paid the jizya tax. The forced levy of children and their compulsory conversion to Islam seem to contradict this principle. However, the system was legitimized through state-sanctioned legal interpretations. According to documents from the Topkapı Palace archives, Ottoman jurists justified the Devşirme based on the concepts of the right of the conqueror and public interest, maslaha. They argued that it was a pre-existing custom and part of the Sultan's sovereign right to ensure the security of the empire. Some quotes from the Sultan's decrees show that this recruitment was considered a prerogative of the state rather than a violation of the law. The role of religion in this was multifaceted. While some conservative Muslim scholars may have privately objected, the official state-controlled religious establishment supported and legitimized the system. For the recruited children, conversion to Islam was a mandatory part of the process. Historical documents record that this process was carried out systematically, and the children were subsequently educated in a purely Islamic environment. This demonstrates a complex intersection between the political needs of the state and the flexible interpretation of religious rules to serve those ends. According to the extensive research of scholar Gülay Yılmaz, published in her book Becoming an Ottoman, The Depths of the Devşirme, the system operated on an extremely methodical and well-documented model. This model consisted of three main stages. The first stage was the selection mechanism. Ottoman archival documents show that the selection was far from random, based instead on very specific criteria. Recruiting officers, typically high-ranking Janissary officers, would travel to rural areas in the Balkans and Anatolia, primarily targeting Christian communities. They sought boys between the ages of 8 and 18, prioritizing those who were healthy, intelligent, and good-looking, and importantly, not an only son to avoid extinguishing a family line. It is estimated that a levy would take place in a given region every 3 to 7 years, and each levy could take between 1,000 and 3,000 children. This process was organized by the Janissary Corps and followed a strict administrative procedure, with registers recording the name, origin, and characteristics of each recruited child. The second stage was the operational and training process. The research of Professor V.L. Menaj indicates that after being selected, these children, called Acemi Oğlan, recruits, would embark on a long journey to the capital, Istanbul. Here, they were circumcised as a rite of conversion to Islam, and most were then sent to live with Turkish peasant families in Anatolia. For a period of 3 to 8 years, they learned the Turkish language, Islamic customs and beliefs, and became accustomed to manual labor. This internship phase aimed to Turkify them, completely erasing memories of their origins. Afterward, they were summoned back to Istanbul. The final stage was the system of supervision and classification. In the capital, these boys were inspected and sorted. The strongest and most robust were trained to join the Janissary Corps, the empire's most elite infantry force. Meanwhile, the most intelligent, clever, and handsome were selected for the prestigious Enderun school inside the Topkapı Palace. Here, they were educated in theology, law, literature, music, and military and administrative skills to become future leaders of the empire, with the potential to rise to the rank of Grand Vizier. Archival documents at the Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul reveal a mechanism of strict control and monitoring of each individual's development throughout their career. In terms of numbers, although exact figures are difficult to determine due to incomplete records over several centuries, researchers have made reliable estimates based on surviving recruitment registers and administrative documents. Historians like Heath Lowry estimate that during the system's most active period, from the 15th to the late 17th century, the total number of individuals affected, that is, the children recruited, could range from 200,000 to 300,000. The annual rate was not fixed, but on average during its peak, several thousand boys were recruited each year. Geographically, the system was concentrated primarily in the Balkan regions such as Albania, Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Greece, areas with large Christian populations. According to some analyses, up to 80% of the recruited children came from this region. The primary age of the children at the time of recruitment was between 8 and 18, but the majority were concentrated in the 10 to 14 age group, which accounted for the highest percentage. Dr. John Fine from the University of Michigan commented, "These numbers speak not only to the scale of the system, but also to the extent of the Ottoman state's penetration into the very family structure of its minority communities. This was not ordinary slave-taking, but a deliberate, regularly executed, and systematic state policy to reshape the demographics of its military and administrative elite. These figures reveal the enormous scale and the systematic, almost industrial nature of the Devşirme phenomenon, making it one of the largest social engineering experiments in pre-modern history. A crucial and core question is, why could a system that caused so much pain and separation endure for more than 3 centuries? The answer lies in a complex network of maintenance and protection mechanisms. The first was the control of information and ideology. The research of historical sociologists shows that once the children were separated from their families, they were placed in a completely controlled environment. All contact with their homeland was severed. They were taught a new language, a new religion, and a new value system in which loyalty to the Sultan was paramount. A specific example is in the Aron school, where cadets were taught that the Sultan was their only father, and their careers depended entirely on his favor. The second was the mechanism of institutional protection. The Devşirme system was not a peripheral department, but the very backbone of the Ottoman army and administration. The Janissary Corps, the direct product of the Devşirme, was the most powerful military force, the protector of the throne. Any opposition to this recruitment system was tantamount to challenging the power of the Janissary Corps itself and the stability of the state. Legal documents from this period indicate that the officials carrying out the levy were granted immense power and were protected by the Sultan's law. The third, and perhaps most important, was the network of interests that the system created. According to the analysis of economic historian Şevket Pamuk, the system generated a self-perpetuating cycle of benefits. Graduates of the Devşirme system, especially from the Aron school, held the most powerful positions in the empire, from provincial governors and army generals to the Grand Vizier. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, a Serbian native recruited through the Devşirme, became one of the greatest Grand Viziers in Ottoman history. These individuals, once at the pinnacle of power, would naturally protect and strengthen the very system that created them, ensuring that it would continue to supply new talent to maintain the power of their class. The impact of this system on individuals, families, and communities was incredibly profound and multifaceted. The historical psychological studies of experts like Dr. Maria Todorova have analyzed the trauma this system left behind. Regarding the psychological impact, for the child, being suddenly separated from family and homeland at a young age was a severe psychological trauma. The forced process of Turkification and Islamization created an identity crisis, as they had to renounce their language, religion, and memories of their origins. Evidence for this can be found in some poems and personal writings of elderly Janissaries, which express a melancholic sadness for a lost past. Regarding the social impact, for the family, it was a tragedy. They lost a son, a source of labor, and an heir. For the community, the Devşirme was a systematic form of brain drain and manpower depletion. It took away the healthiest and most intelligent children, weakening the developmental potential and self-defense capabilities of Christian communities. This led to a decline in population and vitality in some regions that bore the burden of the levy for generations. Regarding the cultural impact, the anthropological research of experts on the Balkans indicates that the memory of the blood tax became deeply ingrained in the folklore of many peoples. Songs, stories, and legends about children being taken by the Turks became part of the cultural identity, expressing the pain and simmering resistance of the people. However, not everyone silently accepted this system. History records many forms of reaction and resistance, from passive to violent. From the late 15th century, when the system was standardized, forms of resistance emerged at the family and community levels. The most common was families trying to hide their sons when recruitment officials arrived in the village, or bribing officials to overlook their children. Some families even had their sons marry early, or inflicted minor injuries on them to make them ineligible. On a larger scale, sometimes entire villages would flee to the mountains together upon hearing that a recruitment party was approaching. In particular, Albanians and some communities in Epirus, Greece, were recorded as having mounted the most determined armed resistance against the levies. Venetian documents record numerous uprisings in Albania during the 16th and 17th centuries, where one of the main causes was opposition to the Devşirme system. These efforts were sometimes successful at a local level, forcing officials to leave empty-handed, but they could rarely change the policy at the imperial level. Nevertheless, these acts of resistance show a clear awareness of the system's injustice and a resilient will to protect family and community, despite the enormous power disparity. The Devşirme system finally came to an end, gradually disappearing in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Its collapse was not due to a single event, but was the result of a profound transformation within the Ottoman Empire itself. Three main factors led to its demise. First, and most importantly, was the change in the nature of the Janissary Corps. Originally an elite slave military force, by the 17th century, the Janissary Corps had become an immensely powerful and hereditary political force. They began to enroll their own sons into the corps, turning it into an almost closed privileged class. The need to recruit from the outside thus diminished, as the Janissaries and their children filled the ranks. Second, the Ottoman Empire's expansion had slowed and entered a defensive phase. The need for a huge continuous supply of soldiers and administrators from newly conquered lands was no longer as pressing as before. Third, internal reforms and changes in the social structure rendered the system obsolete. The decision to allow free-born Muslims to join the Janissary Corps from the late 16th century broke the original logic of the Devşirme. As historian Caroline Finkel assessed, the end of the Devşirme was not a humanitarian act, but an inevitable evolution when its own product, the Janissary Corps, had become too powerful and self-sustaining, making the mechanism that created it unnecessary and even a nuisance. When studying the Devşirme system, we cannot help but recognize similar patterns of state intervention in family structures and child recruitment that have appeared many times throughout history, in different forms and for different purposes. In the 20th century, we see a painful example in Australia with the stolen generations. From the early 1900s until the 1970s, the Australian government had a policy of forcibly removing Aboriginal and mixed-race children from their families. According to official documents, the purpose was to assimilate them into white society. These children were forbidden to speak their native languages and practice their culture, a disturbing parallel to the Turkification process of the Devşirme. In comparison, although the ultimate goals differed, one was to create a military elite, the other racial assimilation, the core mechanism was the same. The state used its power to break the family and cultural bonds of a minority group to serve a larger ideological goal. Similarly, in the 20th and 21st centuries, the recruitment of child soldiers by state and non-state armed forces in many parts of the world also shows common features. Although the context is modern warfare, the act of separating children from the protective environment of their families and turning them into instruments for a military or political purpose is a recurring tragic pattern. This shows that the instrumentalization of children for the benefit of the state or an ideology is a dangerous model likely to reappear in various historical contexts, as noted by Professor Peter Singer in his research on child soldiers. Today, although systematic recruitment forms like the Devşirme no longer exist, forms of exploitation and abuse of children for adult purposes remain a pressing global issue. According to reports from UNICEF and international human rights organizations in 2023, there are hundreds of thousands of children worldwide being used in armed conflicts. Human Rights Watch identifies these modern forms as including children being forced to be soldiers, messengers, spies, or even sexual slaves for armed groups. This situation is particularly prevalent in areas with prolonged conflict such as the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and some parts of the Middle East. Comparing this with the past, although the context has shifted from an organized empire to non-state armed groups or weak states, experts note an alarming similarity in the methodology. Targeting the most vulnerable children, separating them from their families, and using extreme psychological measures to ensure loyalty and obedience. The history of the Devşirme reminds us that when power is unchecked, children are always the most vulnerable to political and military machinations. From the painful lessons of history like the Devşirme and other forms of child exploitation, the international community has striven to develop stronger protection mechanisms. In terms of the legal framework, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, and its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict have been established. These instruments explicitly prohibit the recruitment of children under 18 into armed forces and call on states to criminalize this act. Regarding monitoring mechanisms, organizations like UNICEF and the Office of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General for Children and Armed Conflict conduct global monitoring, reporting, and advocacy activities. They work with governments and stakeholders to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate children who have been drawn into conflict, with operations in dozens of countries. In terms of education and awareness, programs to raise awareness of children's rights and the dangers of exploitation have been implemented in many vulnerable communities, aiming to empower families and children themselves to be able to protect themselves. In academic circles, the topic of the Devşirme continues to be a subject of debate and is evaluated from various perspectives. There are two main schools of thought. The traditional school, which could be called the blood tax tragedy school, focuses on the coercive, violent, and brutal nature of the system. Scholars of this school, primarily from Balkan countries, emphasize the pain of separation, cultural loss, and view the Devşirme as a tool of cruel oppression and exploitation by an empire against its subject peoples. They rely on sources from folklore, church chronicles, and Western documents for their arguments. Conversely, another school, which could be termed the Social Mobility Opportunity School, views the issue from a different angle. These scholars, often from the revisionist school in Turkey and some Western Ottomanists, do not deny the coercion, but stress that the Devşirme was also a unique channel for social advancement. They present evidence of individuals from the Devşirme who reached the pinnacle of power, becoming grand viziers and generals, people who held more power than the Turkish nobility. For a poor peasant boy in the Balkans, this might have been the only path out of poverty to achieve a status they could never have dreamed of. This debate is important because it shows the complexity of history and warns us against viewing historical phenomena one-dimensionally. It impacts how we understand the relationship between ruler and ruled, between opportunity and oppression, issues that remain relevant in the world today. The study of the Devşirme system offers profound lessons that are still valid for modern society. Regarding power, It shows how a centralized state can legalize and normalize acts that violate basic human rights in the name of national security or public interest. This is a reminder of the importance of checks and balances on power, as well as the necessity of a strong civil society to monitor state actions. Regarding information and education, the lesson about information control and ideological indoctrination in the Devşirme system highlights the vital role of pluralistic education and freedom of information. When people, especially children, are isolated from diverse sources of information and exposed to only a single ideology, they are easily manipulated. Regarding community, the small-scale resistance efforts of families and villages demonstrate the indispensable role of community solidarity in protecting its most vulnerable members. As Dr. Gülay Yılmaz remarked, "The Devşirme is not just a story about an empire, it is a story about the limits of state power and human endurance. It forces us to ask, what is a society willing to sacrifice, and who is it willing to sacrifice for the sake of stability and power?" Through our study of the Ottoman Empire's Devşirme system, we have clearly seen several core points. First, we have seen how a state-sponsored system can be intricately and systematically designed and operated to serve political and military objectives, despite the enormous human cost. Second, we have learned the important lesson that such systems not only cause individual trauma, but also leave complex legacies, including unexpected avenues of social mobility, creating a multidimensional and not-so-simple historical picture. And third, we recognize that models of instrumentalizing children for the benefit of power can repeat throughout history in various forms, and that understanding the past is an essential tool for identifying and preventing them in the present. These insights help us to be more vigilant against any ideology or policy that sacrifices the rights and dignity of the most vulnerable individuals in the name of the collective good. Historical knowledge is not just for understanding the past, it is a torch to illuminate the path to building a better future. If this video has helped you better understand the complexity of the Devşirme system and its related lessons, please share it with others who are interested in protecting children and human rights. Subscribe to our channel to continue following our in-depth and meaningful historical analyses, and most importantly, let us know in the comments. What lesson from today's historical account do you think is most important for our society today? Thank you for bravely taking the time to learn about this difficult but essential topic. We will see you in the next video.